Hi, I'm Yeka Marie, and I'm here today to talk to you about costuming at conventions. Hopefully this will be a little bit of a brief history. People have been wearing costumes to events for a very long time. They've been wearing costumes to masquerade balls, also in plays, theatrical events, and even to some events and celebrations like Halloween, before it was really Halloween. The first documented event of people wearing costumes at convention goes all the way back to 1939 at the first World Science Fiction Convention in Manheim, so in New York. Two attendees were there and they were in costume. One was Forrest J. Ackerman and the other was Myrtle Douglas, who is known by the International Costumers Guild as the mother of convention costuming. They were wearing costumes that they dubbed as futuristic costumes. In the years to come, costuming became more and more popular among attendees at the World Science Fiction Convention. And as other conventions sprang up throughout the world, it became more and more acceptable and more expected to wear costumes at conventions. According to Stace of Strangeland Costuming on her website, one of the very first documented masquerades was in 1950 at NorwestCon, which was the name for the WorldCon that year. As to whether or not there were other masquerades going on during this time, it is unknown, but for certain, 1950 saw the dawn of costume contests known as masquerades. In the 1950s, most of the costumes were still original. It wasn't really until the 60s and 70s when the heyday of science fiction and comic books, horror movies, etc. started coming out that people started doing media recreations. Those, of course, existed back in 1939 and through the 40s because one of Forrest J. Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas's first costumes was based on a movie, although I don't believe it was an exact media design, or I don't believe it was an exact media recreation, but it was based on a media source. It is believed that one of the first anime costumes was done in the late 1970s. In 1980, a Starship Yamamoto group was entered into the WorldCon masquerade. Throughout the 1970s, people who enjoyed making and wearing their own costumes to conventions and putting these into masquerades got together and they started connecting, and eventually, in the early 80s, the very first costume con came into existence. The very first costume con happened in 1983. And this was a costume that was different from a lot of the other costumes of the era because it was just about costumes. It wasn't about fandom or about science fiction. It was about costumes of all genres. So this was a very new thing, a very cool thing that still exists to today. Now, in 1984, a gentleman named No Takahashi came over to the US to report on what these crazy Americans were doing wearing costumes at conventions. And what he saw, he thought was really interesting, and he came up with the term, the very Japanese sounding term, cosplay. The term cosplay has thus been around for 30-something years now, but it didn't really get used to describe the phenomenon of wearing costumes to conventions until quite a bit later. Now, some people don't like the term cosplay, and that's okay, and we're not going to get into that. That's something for a whole nother video. But nowadays, a lot of people will use the term cosplay or costuming to talk about convention costuming. Now, since 1984, we've had a lot of new things happen. In 1985, the International Costumers Guild was started, and that is a group that is still in existence today. There have also been several other groups focused on costuming that have popped up. Tons of other conventions have popped up. with the whole Japanimation craze in the 1990s and late 80s, we saw a huge influx of anime conventions, and even throughout the early 2000s, there were still a lot of anime conventions popping up. People are still wearing costumes at conventions all the time nowadays. Of course, there's some discussion about whether or not the term cosplay is appropriate to describe what's going on here. Some people, as I said before, still prefer the term costuming when it comes to describing this. But like I said, that's for another video. There's a lot to unpack there, and sometimes emotions get really high when people start to talk about that. But anyway, in 2016, we are seeing still lots of media recreation. In fact, I would say probably the vast majority of costumes that appear at conventions in the halls or on stage are media recreations. Original design is still very important though, and it is still very much welcomed and celebrated. And at several conventions, historical costuming is also something that is welcomed and celebrated. But the world of costuming is constantly changing, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it continues to change in the years to come. I hope you enjoyed this little introduction to the history of costuming. The history of costuming is so much more deep and rich than I'm able to explain here in this short little video, so please check out the links below for more information. I'm Yeka Marie. If you like this video, please subscribe to this channel. Hit like so that I know you're liking this stuff, because it's hard to tell. And yeah, I'll see you next time.